The so-called angry humans always show up when aliens are in trouble, and this time was no different. Edward Wells, a battle-hardened human soldier, set his ship down on the desolate alien world, not knowing he was about to be hurled into a desperate fight for survival alongside an unlikely ally. The strange energy readings had led him here on a solo recon mission, but as he approached the crash site, it became clear this was no ordinary mission. The twisted wreckage of an advanced Kobali ship lay before him, still smoldering. Movement caught his eye. A wounded alien figure emerged from the debris, struggling to stand. Tyro, the sole survivor. Edward's hand reflexively gripped his weapon, years of training kicking in. But as he drew closer, he could see Tyro barely clung to life, purple blood oozing from multiple wounds. This alien posed no threat, at least not now. Through halting phrases and broken translation, Tyro conveyed the horrifying truth. A ruthless alien race had ambushed the Kobali without warning or mercy. Their ships had been torn apart, their crews slaughtered. Only Tyro had managed to limp away in an escape pod, crashing here. And the attackers were coming to finish the job. Edward faced a split-second decision that could change the course of the future. Leave Tyro to his fate and continue the mission, or stay and fight, risking it all for an alien he'd just met. He thought of Earth, of humanity. If the Kobali fell, his own people could be next. There was no choice, not really. He had to make a stand, here and now. Dragging crates from the wreckage, Edward hastily constructed barricades. Tyro shared what he knew of the incoming threat, their weapons, their tactics, their weaknesses. The human and the Kobali worked in desperate tandem, an unlikely team united by necessity and the looming specter of death. As they labored, a bond formed, the kind forged only in the crucible of battle. Tyro spoke of Kobali honor, of debts that must be repaid no matter the cost. Edward began to understand, if they survived this, if he saved Tyro, the Kobali would owe a debt to humanity, an ally that could tip the scales in the wars to come. But first, they had to live through the next few hours. The scanners showed incoming ships, a deadly swarm hurtling towards them. The odds were impossible, but Edward had his wits, his skills honed in countless battles, and Tyro had the remnants of Kobali technology, weapons powerful enough to maybe, just maybe, give them a chance. Together they hunkered down behind the barricades to await the onslaught, two souls alone on a distant world, facing an implacable foe. The future of their peoples would be written in the blood and fire of this makeshift battleground. Edward glanced at Tyro, seeing the same grim determination etched on the alien's face that he felt in his own heart. Live or die, they would face their fate side by side, for the Kobali, for humanity, and for the glorious tales that would be told of this day, when an alien and a human held the line against all odds. When angry humans fought for a people not their own, and in so doing, changed the destiny of the galaxy forever. The deafening roar of enemy ships filled the air as they descended upon the crash site like a swarm of angry hornets. Edward and Tyro sprang into action, their fingers flying over the controls to activate the makeshift defenses they had cobbled together. The repurposed Kobali energy shields hummed to life, shimmering with an eerie blue glow. Human-made proximity mines blinked red, primed and ready. The first barrage of enemy fire slammed into the energy shields, the impact sending shockwaves through the ground. The shields held, absorbing the brunt of the assault, giving Edward and Tyro a moment to breathe. But they knew it wouldn't last. Edward sprinted to the salvaged Kobali pulse cannon, its sleek lines belying the raw power within. He hefted the weapon, feeling its weight settle into his hands like an old friend. Tyro had shown him the weak points on the enemy ships, and Edward aimed with the practiced ease of a born marksman. The cannon thrummed as Edward squeezed the trigger, sending bolts of searing energy lancing through the air. The shots found their marks, and several enemy ships exploded in brilliant fireballs. But more kept coming, an endless tide of metal and fury. Tyro stood firm beside Edward, a handheld particle beam weapon gripped tight. The Kobali warrior fired with cool precision, picking off the smaller attack drones that tried to flank their position. The air crackled with the energy of their desperate stand. In a momentary lull, Tyro's comm crackled to life. A coded transmission from a hidden Kabali outpost on a nearby moon, the voice on the other end strained, but determined. Reinforcements were coming, a full Kabali fleet. But they needed time. Edward and Tyro locked eyes, a silent understanding passing between them. They had to hold the line, despite the toll. The enemy changed tactics, dropships descending to unleash hordes of armored soldiers. They charged across the barren ground, weapons firing. Edward met them head-on, his human agility and strength a match for their advanced armor. He moved like a whirlwind, fists and feet striking with brutal efficiency. Tyro waded into the fray, using his knowledge of the enemy's technology against them. With deft fingers, he sabotaged weapons and shorted out power armor, evening the odds. But the tide of battle pushed them back, step by step, until they stood with their backs to the wreckage of the Kabali ship. They took cover within its twisted hull, the ship's remaining power a flickering lifeline. Edward worked frantically, rigging the reactor into a makeshift bomb, a last resort. The enemy pressed in, the sound of their advance a drumbeat of doom. Edward and Tyro braced themselves for the end, weapons raised in defiance. But it never came. A shadow fell across the battlefield as a massive Kabali warship dropped out of hyperspace, guns already blazing. Fighters poured from its hangar bays, streaking into the fray with reckless abandon. The reinforcements had arrived, and the tide turned in an instant. Edward and Tyro surged forward, rallying behind the fresh troops. They manned the Kabali ship's weapons, raining fire down upon the enemy. The Zinkari ships fell back before the onslaught, scattering into disarray. The battle raged on, but now it was the Zinkari who were outmatched. One by one, their ships fell from the sky or limped away in retreat. The Kabali fleet pressed the advantage, harrying the enemy until the last of them fled. In the sudden silence that followed, Edward and Tyro stood amidst the wreckage, chests heaving, weapons still hot in their hands. They had done the impossible, held the line against all challenges, but the cost had been high. The Kabali commander landed his shuttle nearby, picking his way through the debris to reach them. His face was grim but grateful as he clasped Edward's hand in a warrior's grip. "You have saved more than just Tyro today," the commander said, his voice rough with emotion. "You have given hope to us all." He revealed the true extent of the Zinkari threat, the worlds they had conquered, the species enslaved. The Kabali were just one among many, but now, with this victory, they had a chance to fight back. The commander offered an alliance, a bond between their peoples. Edward knew what it meant, the responsibility it carried, but he also knew that together they stood a chance against the darkness that threatened to engulf them all. As the Kabali prepared to depart, Edward turned to Tyro, clasping the alien's shoulder. No words were needed. They had forged a bond in the crucible of battle, an understanding that transcended species. Edward watched the Kabali ships ascend into the sky until they were lost amidst the stars. Then he turned his gaze homeward, to Earth. They had won a battle today, but the war was just beginning. And angry humans always did finish the fights they started. Edward Wells stood before the United Nations Security Council, his heart pounding. The chamber buzzed with tension as he faced the skeptical gazes of world leaders. He took a deep breath and began his presentation, recounting the harrowing battle alongside Tyro and the existential threat posed by the Zinkari. "We need to act now," Edward urged, his voice carrying across the room. "The Zinkari won't wait for bureaucracy." But the council members exchanged wary glances. The Chinese representative leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "Mr. Wells, this is an extraordinary claim. We require extraordinary proof before committing global resources to an interstellar war." Edward clenched his fists in frustration as the meeting adjourned without resolution. In his quarters that night, he opened a secure channel to Tyro. "They don't believe me," Edward said, running a hand through his hair. "We need to show them the truth." Tyro's holographic form nodded gravely. "I understand. I will bring a delegation to Earth. Perhaps seeing us in person will convince your leaders." Days later, Edward stood on a military airfield, watching the sky. A hush fell over the assembled soldiers as a sleek Kobali scout ship shimmered into view, hovering above the tarmac. Edward's hand rested on his sidearm, a precaution he hoped was unnecessary. In a flash of light, Tyro materialized alongside two Kobali officers. Their alien features drew gasps from the human soldiers. Edward stepped forward, clasping Tyro's arm in greeting. "Welcome to Earth," he said, then turned to address the wary troops. "Stand down. They're here as allies." In the UN chamber, Tyro activated a holographic projector. The room filled with images of devastated Kobali worlds, cities reduced to ash, ships torn apart by Zinkari weapons. The carnage was undeniable. "This is what awaits Earth if we do not unite against the Zinkari," Tyro stated, his voice somber. Despite the evidence, discord erupted. The Russian representative banged his head on the table. "This could be fabricated. We demand these aliens be detained for questioning." Edward surged to his feet. "No, I vouch for their integrity with my life." He swept his gaze across the room, locking eyes with each leader. Humanity has always found the strength to stand against tyranny. We can't abandon our principles now, when the stakes are highest. His words hung in the air. Slowly, heads began to nod. The vote was close, but in the end, a majority agreed to an initial alliance with the Kobali. Weeks later, Edward boarded a Kobali warship, his new home as Earth's liaison. As the blue marble of his homeworld receded, he thought of the monumental task ahead. In the ship's war room, he clasped Tyro's shoulder. "We've got a lot of work to do, my friend," Edward said. Tyro nodded gravely. "Indeed, the Zinkari grow stronger by the day, but together perhaps we stand a chance." As they bent over star charts, plotting strategy, Edward knew the real battle was just beginning. The fate of Earth, of the entire galaxy, now rested on this fragile alliance. The massive Allied fleet burst into existence above Racnor, a swarm of human and Kobali warships emerging from the swirling vortexes of hyperspace. Edward Wells stood on the bridge of the Kobali flagship, his eyes fixed on the holographic display showing the planet below. "All ships, battle formations," Tyro ordered, his voice calm but tinged with anticipation. "Prepare to engage." The Zinkari response was swift and brutal. Waves of enemy fighters poured from hangars, while their capital ships opened fire with devastating energy weapons. Space itself seemed to ignite as the two forces clashed. "Evasive maneuvers!" Edward shouted as a particle beam sliced through the void, narrowly missing their ship. He watched in horror as several human fighters erupted into fireballs, their pilots' lives snuffed out in an instant. But the tide quickly turned. The sheer number of Allied ships, coupled with Tyro's brilliant tactical mind, allowed them to punch through the Zinkari's outer defenses. Edward coordinated the human boarding parties, his voice steady, as he directed them towards the largest enemy vessels. "Strike Team Alpha, you're clear for insertion," he commanded. "Remember your training. Hit fast, hit hard." The human soldiers, clad in sleek armor that melded Terran and Kobali tech, cut through the Zinkari ships with minimal resistance. Their weapons, a fusion of human ingenuity and alien power sources, proved devastatingly effective in the confined spaces of the enemy vessels. As the space battle raged, Tyro led a precision bombardment of the planet's surface. Edward watched the tactical displays, wincing as each anti-air emplacement was obliterated. It was necessary, he knew, but the destruction still caused great concern on him. "Ground assault team, prepare for drop," Tyro announced. Edward nodded, steeling himself for what was to come. Moments later, he found himself plummeting through Racnor's atmosphere, the G-forces threatening to crush him even through his advanced suit. They landed hard amidst the smoking ruins of a Zinkari battery, the impact sending shockwaves through Edward's body. No sooner had they touched down than the air filled with enemy fire. Plasma bolts sizzled past Edward's head as he dove for cover. "Spread out!" he yelled, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of battle. "Find whatever shelter you can!" The human forces dug in, using the wreckage of Zinkari equipment as makeshift barriers. Edward's heart raced as he saw his soldiers fall, their bodies crumpling under the relentless assault. But he pushed down his grief, focusing on the task at hand. "Kobali reinforcements incoming," a voice crackled over the comm. Edward allowed himself a small smile as he saw the alien dropships descending, their weapons already blazing. With practiced efficiency, Edward organized their defensive line. He directed the placement of satchel charges, creating a deadly minefield for any Zinkari foolish enough to charge their position. The boom of explosions soon joined the sounds of energy weapons as enemy troops triggered the traps. Above, the space battle continued to rage. Edward caught glimpses of it through gaps in the clouds, flashes of light and distant explosions as ships on both sides were torn apart. But slowly, inexorably, the Allied fleet gained the upper hand. Days blurred together in a haze of constant combat. Edward led charge after charge, using the humans' unconventional tactics to outmaneuver the more rigid Zinkari forces. They captured defensive positions one by one, each victory bringing them closer to their ultimate goal. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of fighting, they broke through. Edward stood at the entrance to Rachnor's primary spaceport, his armor scarred and his body aching, but alive. Around him, human and Kobali soldiers cheered as Allied reinforcements began to pour in. In orbit, the last remnants of the Zinkari fleet attempted to flee, but Edward had planned for this. Reserve squadrons lying in wait pounced on the retreating ships, their weapons tearing through hulls, weakened by days of battle. Only a handful of enemy vessels managed to escape into hyperspace. As the dust settled and the extent of their victory became clear, Edward found himself surrounded by celebrating troops, human and Kobali alike. They clapped him on the back, shook his hand, some even embraced him. He had led them through hell, and they had emerged victorious. Tyro approached, his alien features set in what Edward had come to recognize as a smile. "Well done, my friend," the Kobali commander said. "Rachnor is ours, the first of many victories to come." Edward nodded, too exhausted for words. He knew the war was just the beginning, but they had taken a crucial first step. As he looked out over the battered but triumphant Allied forces, he allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. Together, they just might have a chance of saving the galaxy. The taste of victory at Rachnor was still fresh when Edward Wells found himself crouched behind the twisted wreckage of a Zinkari fighter, plasma bolts sizzling overhead. The acrid smell of burning metal filled his nostrils as he signaled to his team, a mix of human and Kobali soldiers, to advance. To "Move up! We hit that comm relay and their whole defense grid goes dark." Edward's voice carried over the din of battle. They sprinted from cover to cover, their boots crunching on the debris-strewn ground of the Zinkari outpost. Edward's heart pounded as he dove behind a low wall, narrowly avoiding a barrage of enemy fire. Beside him, a young human soldier named Garcia grinned through the grime on his face. "Just another day at the office, eh, boss?" Edward nodded, allowing himself a tight smile. These hit-and-run tactics had become second nature, a deadly dance they performed across the sector. He peeked over the wall, spotting the gleaming spire of the comm relay. "Covering fire!" Edward shouted, and the air filled with the staccato rhythm of human weapons and the high-pitched whine of Kobali energy guns. As they pushed forward, Edward caught glimpses of the chaos they'd sown throughout the Zinkari base. Smoke billowed from destroyed supply depots, and the wreckage of enemy ships littered the landing pads. They were meters from the relay when a Zinkari patrol rounded the corner. Time seemed to slow as Edward saw the enemy raise their weapons. He opened his mouth to shout a warning, but Garcia was already moving. The young soldier tackled Edward, pushing him to safety as plasma bolts tore through the air where he'd been standing. Edward hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from his lungs. He rolled, bringing his weapon to bear, and cut down the Zinkari with precise bursts. But when he turned back, his blood ran cold. Garcia lay motionless, a smoking hole in his chest armor. "Medic!" Edward screamed, crawling to his friend's side. But as he cradled Garcia's head, he saw the light fade from the young man's eyes. The mission blurred after that. Edward moved on autopilot, planting the charges on the relay, calling the extraction. But as their ship lifted off, leaving the burning outpost behind, all he could see was Garcia's face. In the days that followed, Edward threw himself into planning the next raid, and the next, and the next. He pored over tactical displays, pushing for riskier targets, longer odds. "We need to hit them harder," Edward growled during a strategy meeting, his fist slamming onto the hollow table. "Make them bleed for every inch." Tyro, his Kobali friend and fellow commander, placed a steadying hand on Edward's shoulder. "We must be cautious, Edward. The Zinkari grow stronger, more prepared. We cannot afford to be reckless." But Edward shrugged off the touch, his eyes blazing. "Caution won't win this war. We strike now, while we have the advantage." He stormed out, leaving concerned murmurs in his wake. That night, as Edward lay in his bunk, he pulled out the worn photo of his team, Garcia's smiling face at the center. He traced a finger over the image, his jaw clenching. "I'll make it right," he whispered. "I promise." Days later, Edward stood on the bridge of a human assault craft, staring at the massive Zinkari shipyard looming before them. This was it, the chance to deal a crippling blow to the enemy's production capabilities. "All units, prepare for assault," Edward's voice crackled over the comms. "Remember the plan. We go in fast, hit hard, and get out." But as their ships closed in, alarms blared. The Zinkari had detected them early, their defenses already coming online. "Abort!" Tyro's voice cut through the chaos. "Edward, we must retreat. It's a trap." Edward hesitated, his hand hovering over the controls. Then he saw it. A gap in the enemy formation, a path straight to the heart of the shipyard. "Negative," he growled. "We push through. All units, follow my lead." He gunned the engines, ignoring the frantic calls from Tyro and the other commanders. As they punched through the defensive line, Edward allowed himself a fierce grin. They would make the Zinkari pay, no matter the consequences. But that cost soon became apparent. Enemy fire tore through their formation, human and Kobali ships erupting into fireballs. Edward's craft shuddered under the assault, alarms screaming as systems failed. "We're cut off," a panicked voice shouted over the comms. "There's too many of them." Edward's mind raced, searching for a way out, but as he looked at the tactical display, his stomach dropped. They were surrounded, trapped in a Zinkari kill box. The bridge of his ship filled with the sound of incoming transmissions as the Allied fleet diverted to rescue them. Edward watched helplessly as Kobali capital ships took devastating hits, their hulls buckling under the Zinkari onslaught. Hours later, as the battered remnants of their force limped back to base, the full weight of what he'd done crashed down on Edward. He'd let his thirst for vengeance override everything else, and now others had paid the price. He was still numb with shock when Tyro found him, the Kobali's eyes flashing with anger. Without a word, Tyro's fist connected with Edward's jaw, sending him sprawling. "You fool!" Tyro shouted, his usual calm shattered. "Do you realize what you've cost us? The lives lost? The ships destroyed?" Edward pushed himself up, tasting blood. "I had to do something. We can't just sit back and—" "Enough," Tyro cut him off. "Your recklessness nearly doomed us all. And yet—" The Kobali's voice trailed off, and Edward looked up in confusion. Tyro's expression had shifted, a mix of frustration and something else. "What?" Edward asked, wary. Tyro sighed heavily. "Your ill-conceived assault provided cover for one of our stealth teams. They infiltrated a Zinkari research facility and uncovered this." He activated a holographic display, showing schematics for a massive weapon. Edward's eyes widened as he read the specifications, his blood running cold. "A planet killer," he whispered. Tyro nodded grimly. "Capable of rendering entire worlds uninhabitable. If not for your distraction, we might never have discovered it in time." The weight of it all, the losses, the near disaster, and now this terrifying new threat, crashed down on Edward. He slumped against the wall, his head in his hands. "What have I done?" he murmured. Tyro's voice softened slightly. You let your pain cloud your judgment, my friend. But now we must focus on what comes next. The Zincari must be stopped before it's too late. Edward looked up, meeting Tyro's gaze. He saw the same fire, the same commitment that had driven their alliance from the beginning. Slowly, he nodded, pushing himself to his feet. "You're right," Edward said, his voice hoarse but resolute. "No more reckless gambits. We do this together or not at all." Tyro clasped his shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that transcended their species. "Together, then, we have one chance to end this threat before it begins." As they walked towards the war room, Edward felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The grief for Garcia, for all they'd lost, was still there. But now it fueled a new purpose, a drive to ensure those sacrifices weren't in vain. The next few days were a blur of planning and preparation. Edward threw himself into the work, coordinating with human and Kobali forces alike. They pored over intelligence reports, studying every scrap of data on the Zincari superweapon and its construction site. Finally, as the Allied Armada prepared for the desperate assault on Khazratik, Edward addressed the assembled troops. Humans and Kobali stood side by side, united in purpose. "This is it," Edward said, his voice carrying across the hangar bay. "Everything we fought for comes down to this moment. The Zincari think they can break us, but they don't understand what we're fighting for. We're not just defending our worlds, we're fighting for the right of every species to live free from tyranny." A cheer went up from the assembled soldiers. Edward nodded to Tyro, who stepped forward. "Today we strike at the heart of our enemy," the Kobali commander added. "Let them feel the strength of our alliance, the power of our combined will. For Kobali, for Earth, for all free peoples, we fight." As one, the troops roared their approval. Edward felt a surge of pride, of belonging. This was what he'd been missing, blinded by his quest for vengeance. This unity, this shared purpose. He turned to Tyro, extending his hand. The Kobali clasped it firmly. "Whatever happens," Edward said, "it's been an honor." Tyro nodded solemnly. "The honor has been mine, my friend. Now let us finish this." Together, they boarded the lead assault craft. As the bay doors opened, revealing the swirling vortex of hyperspace, Edward took a deep breath. They were about to jump into the unknown, to face an enemy more powerful than any they'd encountered. But as he looked around at the determined faces of his comrades, human and Kobali alike, Edward knew they had a chance, not just to win a battle, but to forge a future where their peoples stood together against any threat. The order came through, and the fleet leapt into hyperspace. Towards Khazratik, towards the Zincari superweapon, towards a reckoning that would shape the destiny of the universe.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.